Well, Matt Hancock is once again in the headlines for all the wrong reasons after a leak of 100,000 of his WhatsApp messages was published by The Telegraph. This is a crazy story. It's hard to believe that something like this could even have happened. Who is involved? What's going on? What did the messages say? And most importantly, was it right for the messages to be published in the first place? We're going to digest it all right now. But first, who is the journalist in question? So the journalist who published these messages is Isabel Oakeshott. She's a well-known political journalist here in the UK. She began reporting in politics just over a decade ago, began at the Sunday Times in 2010, became political editor there. She had a stint at the Daily Mail as political editor at large. Now she's big in TV and she is very well known. She's a Brexiteer. She's usually on the right on the political spectrum. And most importantly, she has taken a very skeptical view towards COVID lockdown restrictions. Aside from that, she's also authored several non-fiction books, including the one that she worked on with Matt Hancock, The Pandemic Diaries, and that becomes important when we look at how she came into possession of those messages. This is where things begin to get really confusing because to any regular observer, you look at the personalities of Matt Hancock and Isabel Oakeshott. You've got Matt Hancock, who was very, very tough in terms of pushing for lockdown restrictions. He wanted to see schools closed. He wanted to see shops closed. He wanted people to follow all the rules, even though he didn't follow them himself, but that's another story. On the other hand, you've got Isabel Oakeshott, who is very clear and outspoken in her views that lockdown restrictions were the wrong move to take after the first months of the pandemic. She was opposed to schools closing and several other measures as well. So the fact that Matt Hancock chose Isabel Oakeshott to co-author his Pandemic Diaries, at the time, we didn't really think much of it. It was like, oh, he's got a new book out. Let's see what he's going to say, blah, 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 blah. But now in hindsight, it is certainly a peculiar choice. Why did Matt Hancock choose Isabel Oakeshott when they have such different views? Surely he would have known that that was the case. I think it's probably because he thought that she was a brilliant author. She's got a good track record on writing books. And so he thought, actually, I want the best person to tell my story. So therefore, I'm going to trust Isabel Oakeshott. But certainly now looking back, and he must be thinking to himself, what on earth was I thinking, giving a lockdown skeptic all of this information? And now this is where the text messages come in. Because in order for Isabel Oakeshott to write the book, she needed all the information. And some of that information came from Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages, and he handed over to her 100,000 WhatsApp messages. 100,000. It's crazy. It beggars belief that he would give them to a journalist like Isabel Oakeshott, who clearly doesn't agree with his views. He must have been very naive at the time. Now, Oakeshott has given several interviews where she's spoken at length about how these WhatsApp messages were combed through and the effort it took from Telegraph journalists to go through these messages to find the key bits of information. She talks about how they did it in a bunker at the Telegraph Towers. It's quite extraordinary. Much has also been made of all of the accusations and all of the little tidbits that have been found in the messages and what Matt Hancock said at the time. I'm not going into too much detail about that, but there's some very interesting things we should point out. There's the fact that Matt Hancock appeared to reject care home testing advice, the fact that he appeared to mock the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which was a Rishi Sunak brainchild. He mocked it as the, quote, Eat Out to help the virus get about. You've got him and Cabinet Secretary Simon Case, the top civil servant, by the way, in government, mocking those who stayed in quarantine hotels, people who paid thousands of pounds to visit the UK, possibly to see loved ones in their last days. You have the health secretary and the top government civil servant mocking those people. These are just a few of the many unedifying claims that have come from these leaks. Very embarrassing for Matt Hancock and very embarrassing for all of those who've been implicated. So now, with all of that in mind, we have to ask ourselves this very important question. Was the publication of these messages in the public interest? To which my answer is absolutely yes. Before I explain why though, let me preface what I'm about to say with the following. I personally disagree with Isabel Oakeshott's worldview on the pandemic and on the lockdown restrictions. I think that they were necessary. I think millions of lives were saved through lockdown. Yes, lockdown had its cost, especially on children. It was a very, very dark time. But I think millions and millions of lives were saved because of the lockdown. Millions and millions of people are not going through long COVID at the moment because of the lockdown. And I think it was right that those restrictions were in place until the vaccine came along. A lot of folks who think like Isabel Oakeshott are, I think, trying to rewrite history here and make out that we could have, gone through the initial bit of the pandemic without lockdown measures. The first couple of months would have been fine to have in lockdown, but after that, the summer 2020, autumn 2020, we should have let rip and we shouldn't have had these restrictions. I think that is patently wrong. And I think it's actually quite dangerous. And I think a lot of people are forgetting that if you got COVID in 2020 before the vaccine came along, you stood a very high chance of ending up in hospital, ending up on a ventilator, and potentially even dying. The idea that we couldn't have had restrictions, we couldn't have had social distancing, I think is a very dangerous one. And I think people are trying to make out, with the benefit of hindsight now, people are trying to say, oh no, we should have just let rip, it would have been okay, let the young people get COVID and let's protect the elderly people. That is all nonsense. And what I don't like about this leak is that this is being used as a way to reinforce that argument, right? Matt Hancock is being used as a pawn in Isabel Oakeshott's anti-lockdown crusade and in the Telegraph's overall anti-lockdown crusade. And of course, nobody wants lockdown. Absolutely no one wants lockdown. But we have to be clear that at the time, it was necessary to go into lockdown. And anyone who says it wasn't necessary to go into lockdown, and anyone who thinks that the virus should just be let rip before the vaccine came along, I think is wrong. Once the vaccine came along, that's when the restrictions began to be lifted. And that is where I agree with Matt Hancock and his approach. It might be unpopular to say I agree with Matt Hancock, but I'm going to say it. He took the right approach by wanting stricter restrictions before the vaccine. Then after the vaccine, we let rip. He didn't follow his own rules. That was bad. He resigned for it. He was right to resign for it. But in terms of the actual lockdown policy, I'm on his side, and I don't agree with Isabel Oakeshott. And all that this is doing is serving to reinforce the Telegraph's anti-lockdown view. That's all this is. Having said all that, there is no question in my mind that Isabel Oakeshott was right to publish these messages. No question about it. These messages are absolutely in the public interest. These conversations, the decisions that were taken at the time, impacted the lives of millions of people in this country. Every single person in this country was affected by these restrictions. The public absolutely has a right to know about what the thinking was behind the decisions that were taking place at the time. Isabel Oakeshott herself has said that publishing the messages with the Telegraph was in the public interest because they shed light on the inner workings of government as it responded to the COVID pandemic. Not one journalist worth their salt would sit on a cache of information in such an important matter, in such a historic matter, and cover that up. And of course, she's completely and utterly right. The fact that you have 100,000 messages from the top elected health official in the UK and you wouldn't do anything about it? Really? I don't think so. Of course you're going to publish them. For his part, Matt Hancock says that he is hugely disappointed and sad at the massive betrayal and breach of trust by Isabel Oakeshott. Yeah, you can be disappointed by it, but you shouldn't be surprised by it. What did you think was going to happen? You gave a journalist who disagrees with you on these issues 100,000 of your WhatsApp messages. You really shocked that she was going to do this big leak? Really, Matt? Come on. Pay attention. Of course she was going to leak them. He said that there's no public interest case for this huge breach because all of the material used for his book was given to the inquiry, the public inquiry into COVID. Yes, I get it. Let the official inquiry do its job. But at the same time, you made the decision to give her these texts. You made the decision to work with her. I'm afraid that is the consequence, whether you like it or not. I don't agree with her worldview at all. But from a journalistic point of view, it is absolutely the right thing to do. A public inquiry could take years. It could take 3, 4, 5, 10 years even. So any information that we can get now to glean from and to learn lessons from is always going to be a good thing as the The next pathogen could be on the way anytime now. We don't know when it's going to happen. It could be in 100 years' time. It could be in 10 years' time, 5 years' time. There will be another pandemic. Lessons need to be learned. And so the sooner we can learn those lessons, the better. Woo!